Poor Carl here doesn't know what the civil rights movement is, but it's okay, because I'm here and I'm going to teach Carl and you watching what the civil rights movement really is. So we have all heard about the civil rights movement with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., but there's so much more to it and you're going to find out about all of that in this video. Hi, I'm Alina and I'll be teaching you about the civil rights movement. So what is the civil rights movement? Well, it started in the 1950s and continued into the 60s. Beginning after the Civil War, the civil rights movement was a struggle for social justice. It was meant for blacks to gain equal rights under the law in the United States. Even though the Civil War had abolished slavery, it did not stop the discrimination towards blacks, and they continued to be victims of racism, especially in the South. In the mid-20th century, blacks had had enough. They were done with the prejudice and the violence. The blacks, along with the whites, united and began the fight for equality that had spanned for 2 decades. During Reconstruction, the blacks had taken on leadership roles. They were a part of public office and they were making legislative changes for equality and the right to vote. In 1868, the 14th Amendment gave blacks equal protection under the law. In 1870, the 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. Even with this, people in the South were still quite upset. In fact, in order to separate the whites and erase the progress that the blacks had made during Reconstruction, the South established the Jim Crow laws in the 19th century. The Jim Crow laws had stated that the blacks could not use the same public facilities as whites, line in the same town, or go to the same schools as whites. Along with this, interracial marriage was illegal and many blacks were unable to vote because they did not pass the voter literacy test. Southern segregation increased when the U.S. Supreme Court had declared in Plessy v. Ferguson that facilities for black and whites could be separate but equal. This discrimination was seen everywhere, even in the military. Before World War II, most blacks were low-wage farmers, factory workers, domestics, or servants. In the early 1940s, which was before the Civil Rights Movement, war-related work such as being a part of the military was booming, but blacks were not given the better-paying jobs. They were discouraged from joining the military, and when thousands of blacks threatened to march on Washington in order to demand for equal employment rights, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president at that time, had issued the Executive Order 8802. This opened national defense jobs and other government jobs to all Americans no matter their race, creed, color, or nationality. Black men and women had served in World War II even though they still suffered with segregation and discrimination during their deployment. In fact, even when returning home, many black veterans were greeted with prejudice and inequality. However, it was during this time where many people had made breakthroughs. For instance, the Tuskegee Airmen had broke a racial barrier as they became the first black military aviator in the U.S. Army Air Corps. When the Cold War began, the President Harry Truman implemented a civil rights agenda and issued an executive order in 1948 to end discrimination in the military. This was quite significant because it laid the foundation to enact racial equality legislation and it ignited the civil rights movement, especially with the mother of the modern-day civil rights movement. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks found a seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus after work. But let me set the picture. During this time, segregation laws had stated that blacks must sit in the designated seat at the back of the bus, and Parks complied and did just this. She sat at the back of the bus. Then a white man got on the bus. He was unable to find a seat in the white section, which was in the front of the bus. The bus driver demanded that Rosa Parks and 3 other black men give up their seats. Parks had refused and she was arrested. When news of her arrest had spread, outrage and support had spread throughout, and this was when Rosa Parks became the mother of the modern-day civil rights movement. Black community leaders formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, also known as MIA, which was led by Martin Luther King Jr. This role would place him front and center in the fight for civil rights. Parks' courage to stand up for herself had inspired the MIA to stage a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. This boycott had lasted for 381 days. Then, on November 14, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregated seating was unconstitutional. This was just the beginning. In 1954, the civil rights movement gained momentum when the U.S. Supreme Court had made segregation illegal in public schools in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. In 1957, the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, asked for volunteers from an all-black high school to attend the formerly segregated school. On September 3, 1957, 9 black students, Thelma Mothershed Ware, Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, Jefferson Thomas, Terrence Roberts, Carlota Walls Lanier, Gloria Ray Karlmark, Ernest Green, Elizabeth Eckford, and Melba Patillo Beals, also known as the Little Rock Nine, arrived at Central High School to begin classes. but instead they were met with a screaming, threatening mob and the Arkansas National Guard, which was an order from Governor Orval Faubus. A couple of weeks later, the Little Rock Nine had tried again and made it inside, but they had to be removed for their safety when violence had begun. Due to this, President Dwight Eisenhower had came into the conflict and ordered for federal troops to escort the Little Rock Nine to and from classes. However, the students continued to face harassment and prejudice along with many threats. Their attempts, however, fueled much needed attention to this issue. Eisenhower wanted to show his commitment to the civil rights movement and wanted to reduce the racial tensions in the South. So, he pressured Congress to consider new civil rights legislation. All Americans had gained the right to vote, but even with this, the southern states still made it difficult for blacks as they required them to take voter literacy tests that were confusing, misleading, and nearly impossible to pass. For instance, it would include confusing questions such as circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line or spell backwards forwards. On September 9, 1957, President Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 into law. This was the first major civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It gave federal prosecution of anyone who tried to prevent someone from voting. It also created a commission to investigate voter fraud. As progress was making headway, blacks were still met with prejudice in their daily lives. On February 1, 1960, 4 college students took a stand against segregation in Greensboro, North Carolina. They refused to leave a Woolworth lunch counter without being served. Over a couple of days, hundreds of people joined their cause. This became known as the Greensboro Sit-ins. Some were arrested, others were charged with trespassing. Protesters had launched a boycott of all segregated lunch counters until the owners finally gave in, and the original 4 students were finally served at the Woolworth's lunch counters, where they first took a stand. Because of their efforts, they helped launch the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, which encouraged students to get involved in the civil rights movement. Moreover, it caught the attention of Stokely Carmichael, who was a young graduate who joined this committee. In 1966, he became the chair of the SNCC and gave his famous speech in which he originated the phrase Black Power. On May 4th of 1961, 7 African Americans and 6 whites, also known as the Freedom Riders, had gone onto a Greyhound bus in Washington, D.C., where they embarked on a bus tour of the American South to protest segregated bus terminals. They were putting the 1960 decision, which was passed by the Supreme Court in Boynton v. Virginia, to the test. It declared the segregation of interstate transportation facilities unconstitutional. The Freedom Riders had drawn a lot of international attention as they faced violence from both white protesters and police officers. On Mother's Day in 1961, the bus had reached Anniston, Alabama, where a mob had gone onto the bus and threw a bomb into it. The Freedom Riders were able to escape, but were badly beaten. The riders could not find a bus driver to take them further, so the brother of President John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, had negotiated with the Alabama governor, John Patterson, to find a suitable driver, and on May 20th, the Freedom Riders continued their journey with police escort. When they reached Montgomery, the police officers left the group as they were greeted with a white mob, which brutally attacked the bus. Attorney General Kennedy responded to the riders and Martin Luther King Jr., who also had reached out. Attorney General Kennedy had sent federal marshals to Montgomery. On May 24, 1961, a group of Freedom Riders had reached Jackson, Mississippi. The group was met with hundreds of supporters, but they were sentenced to 30 days in jail because they trespassed in a whites-only facility. Attorneys for the NAACP had brought the situation to the Supreme Court, who had reversed the convictions. Hundreds of new Freedom Riders were drawn to the cause, and the rides continued. In the fall of 1961, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was pressured by the Kennedy administration, had issued regulations prohibiting segregation in interstate transit terminals. Then, on August 28th in 1963, probably one of the most famous events of the civil rights movement took place, the March on Washington. This march was organized and attended by civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and Martin Luther King Jr. More than 200,000 people, black and white, congregated in Washington, D.C. for the peaceful march. The main purpose was to force civil rights legislation and to establish job equality for everyone. The highlight of the march was Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day Even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
His speech soon became the slogan for equality and freedom. On July 2nd of 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The legislation was initiated by President John F. Kennedy. Martin Luther King Jr. and many other civil rights activists had witnessed the signing. The law had given and guaranteed equal employment for all, limited the use of voter literacy tests, and allowed federal authorities to ensure public facilities were integrated. On March 7, 1965, the civil rights movement in Alabama had become violent when 600 peaceful demonstrators participated in the Selma to Montgomery March to protest the killing of black civil rights activist Jimmie Lee Jackson by a white police officer and to encourage legislation to enforce the 15th Amendment. When the protesters had neared the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the protesters were blocked by Alabama state and local police, who were sent by the Alabama governor, George C. Wallace, who was a vocal opponent of desegregation. When the protesters moved forward, they were viciously beaten and tear gassed by the police. Dozens of protesters were hospitalized, and the incident came to be known as Bloody Sunday. Some activists wanted to fight back with violence. However, Martin Luther King Jr. pushed for nonviolent protests and eventually gained federal protection for another march. On August 6th of 1965, when President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, he took the Civil Rights Act further. The new law had banned all voter literacy tests and provided federal examiners in certain voting jurisdictions. In addition to this, in 1966, in the Harper v. Virginia State Board of Elections, poll taxes were declared unconstitutional. With all of the progress made in the civil rights movement, the movement had very unfortunate results for 2 of its leaders in the late 1960s. On February 21, 1965, the former leader of the Nation of Islam and the founder of Organization of Afro-American Unity, Malcolm X, was assassinated at a rally. On April 4th of 1968, the civil rights leader and the Nobel Peace Prize recipient, Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated on his hotel's balcony. Due to this, many emotionally led looting and riots had taken place, which put more pressure on the Johnson administration to push through additional civil rights laws. A couple of days after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was out into place on April 11th. It had prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, disability, religion, gender, family status, or nationality. The civil rights movement was a powerful movement, yet an uncertain movement for the blacks in America. Due to the efforts of civil rights activists and many protesters of all races, legislation to end segregation, the end of black voter suppression, discriminatory employment, and housing practices were all put into place. So there you have it, Carl. I think now you have a much better idea what the civil rights movement really is, and I hope you watching learned a lot as well.